Joining us now is Christiana Figueres, a Global Optimism founding partner and a former executive secretary for the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. She oversaw the adoption of the Paris Climate Agreement on climate change in 2015 and brought together governments, corporations, and financial institutions. Her bio would take me like an hour to go through. She's also the co-author of the book, The Future We Choose. So yesterday was quite significant for the U.S., and the idea that it's about aligning everybody's interests. So something that was really that I'm curious about is, can you have multilateralism on climate, but unilateralism in the geopolitical sphere in other areas? Is that possible?
Well, we proved that it was possible when the Paris Agreement was adopted, because we tend to forget that we didn't have, perfect geopolitical alignment on all issues, even in 2015, just like we don't do now. But what makes climate change so unique is the very simple fact that we're all still on this planet until we decide to leave it. And we're all being affected. It is the most urgent and the most critical common interest issue for all countries. That is why it has been possible to ring-fence climate change as a common interest issue, despite the fact that there may be other tensions, for example, between the United States and China on so many other issues. But we're all in the same boat here, and most countries have actually understood that.
But if different countries rank climate differently in terms of the relative importance of their relationships with others, I do wonder, Christiana, whether or not, for instance, China could use climate as a bargaining chip to achieve other objectives.
Well, we haven't really seen that because it's not the case that China or the United States or the European Union or any other country can unilaterally solve the climate issue. We actually need everyone. So as I said, let's underline the common interest. Yes, China could delay, but it's not in their interest to delay. They actually are the highest investors in the world in solar technology, in wind technology, in battery technology, in charging networks. They are the highest investors in the world. Why? First, because their own population has put pressure on them. Who wants to have gray skies and completely polluted air all the time? So that has been on the table. But secondly, because they understand that as they are coming out of the poverty levels they used to have, they can no longer compete on the international scene with ultra low production costs. They're having to pay, and fortunately they're doing that, they're having to pay much better wages. So losing the competitive advantage that they had, they now have to move to a different competitive advantage for the new economy. What is that? Low carbon. That is why they are investing as much as they have been investing over the past 5 to 10 years into the low carbon economy because of competitive reasons.
Mm-hmm. Christiana, you were in the room in 2015, and a lot has changed in those 6 years. The elephants in the room were things like carbon pricing, carbon offsets, border tax for carbon, climate financing. Where is that conversation now? Like, the elephants in the room are still elephants. How do we address it?
Well, two issues, very different progress. One is carbon financing or climate financing, and the other is carbon pricing. Let me start with carbon pricing, because that actually continues to be the elephant in the room. We don't really have much progress since Paris on that. And that is really too bad, because carbon pricing, whether it's through a tax or whether it's through a cap and trade system, either way gives you a price, would actually accelerate decarbonization. Currently, we only have 60 jurisdictions around the world that have one or the other type of carbon price. Average price around the world is now about $20 a ton. By the time it gets to $100 a ton or more, then we're really talking about an instrument that is going to help us decarbonize. But we are definitely not there yet.
Christiana, let's just talk about Europe then. Can we just talk about Europe for just a moment in there? Europe has implemented a carbon tax, and the cost of carbon is now significantly higher. In fact, it continues to make records on an almost daily basis. What do you take away from that? Is that working? Is that not working?
That is working because Europe is the prime region in the world that has managed to decouple greenhouse gas emissions from their GDP growth. They have totally decoupled. We actually have a total of 32 countries, including some developing countries, but certainly the European Union, that has managed to decouple. And that is fundamentally the task of this decisive decade. It is that decisive decoupling through a carbon price, through regulation, through legislation, through many other instruments to decouple, continue economic growth, but decrease the emissions of greenhouse gases.
OK, so Europe's making some progress. European companies are paying the price for that. They've got to fork out significant amounts of money. But other companies around the world are not. So what should Europe do next? Alix mentioned carbon border taxes. Do you think Europe should be imposing carbon border taxes to try and level the playing field?
Well, Europe did somewhat of an attempt to that several years ago. I can't remember how many, maybe 3 or 4 or maybe even 5 years ago with aviation, and didn't get very far because it is not a unilateral decision. It actually does have to go through some questioning from WTO, from the World Trade Organization. So yes, it is something that the countries that have a carbon price or that have good regulation have been thinking for a while. But actually, I wonder if that is really the route to be pursued. Personally, I would prefer, instead of punishing those that are not doing it, to actually encourage and incentivize those who are not doing it to get onto the bandwagon because it is in their interest.
So, Christiana, you raised the whole point of the carrot versus the stick. So let's go to the carrot, which is climate financing. What's the best way you found for, well, how does this evolve, I guess, is the best question.
Well, financing, actually, the financing sector is the sector that I have really been in total awe over the past 2 to 3 years, how the capital markets have shifted and how international finance has shifted dramatically. And you heard John Kerry and President Biden yesterday, but John Kerry before, already coming out with how the United States is going to be directing their foreign direct investment. Yesterday, you heard Korea say they're going to stop financing coal overseas. Huge step forward. Now, your very own Bloomberg New Energy Finance has told us just very recently that the whole of the energy transition investment in the world went up $500 billion last year, with respect to 2019. And that was in a COVID year in which there was actually a low demand for energy. So now can you imagine when there is a higher demand? We know just in the United States, we know Citi and Morgan Stanley have recently committed to $1 trillion to sustainable finance, JP Morgan, $2.5 trillion, and the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, that is being chaired by Mark Carney, actually has already united 160 financial firms with a combined asset of $70 trillion. And they're all accelerating their transition to net zero by 2050 at the latest. So that is a tectonic shift in the financial sector. Why are they doing it? To protect their assets. They are afraid of the risk, and they are being attracted by the opportunity.